In this video, I'm going to take a look at how some of the best and most expensive camera lenses ever made have been copied and cloned by other manufacturers. Consider, for example, these three famous old lenses. Each lens has been recreated and sold as a less costly alternative. Then there are top-rated lenses such as the Carl Zeiss Outron and the Leica Summicron, where it's possible to buy alternative lenses that may not be exact copies. They may not even have precisely the same optical design, but you'd be hard-pressed to spot a significant difference in images. I'm calling these lenses Princes and Paupers. The Princes are classic royalty amongst lenses, and the Paupers, the budget alternatives. The Paupers may be less glamorous, but sometimes they'll give you 90% of the performance for 10% of the price. Perhaps Pauper is a little unfair in some cases, as a number of the lenses I'll be talking about are now quite expensive as well, and beautifully made, but they're much less expensive than the original classics, and in a few notable cases, the copies may actually be better than the originals. I've divided the Princes and Paupers into 5 categories. I'll cover each category in turn, and within each category, I'll talk in a little more detail about specific pairs of lenses that I hope you'll find interesting. Now, there's a wealth of information and videos online talking about less expensive copies of classic lenses, and I'm not going to try to include all these lenses. Instead, it would be great if you could let us know your own favourite examples in the comments below, and together we can compile a good list of lenses worth looking at. I'll start with direct look-alike copies of classic lenses, and I'm thinking specifically about copies made many years ago, primarily in the Soviet Union, China and Japan. I'll cover modern copies later. The iconic West German Leitz Elmer 50 f3.5, made for the early Leica cameras dating back to the 1920s, is one of the most copied lenses. Here are a few examples of these lenses, starting in 1933 with a lens on a Japanese copy of the Leica 2. The company subsequently became Canon, by the way. In the Soviet Union, Fed also produced Elmar copies, and the lenses are still easy to pick up for sale online. Indostar even went as far as producing a fake Leica, complete with fake Leica and Leitz engravings. I rather like the bling of this gold clone. And in 1958 in China, the Shanghai company, later called Seagull, produced the Shanghai 58, based on the Leica 3. As a matter of interest, British and American companies were not above making look-alike copies of Leica designs. If you'd like to learn more about these copies, I recommend this blog posting for more information, and there's also a book on the subject. The next set of Princes and Paupers is where manufacturers took classic optical designs and made new, sometimes improved versions of the classic lenses. Again, lenses in this category are no longer being produced. The most famous group is probably the Helios copies of Carl Zeiss Jena Biotar lenses. The Biotar 75 f1.5 allegedly was the basis for the Soviet Union's Helios 40, and the Biotar 58 f2 was the basis for the Helios 44 and subsequent versions of the 44 series. I love my classic old Biotar with its 17 blades. It's a jewel of lens engineering. But I have to say, I love my early silver Helios 44 even more for photography. I just find it a better lens for close-up, wide-open shots. The Soviets were particularly active in copying Western designs of all kinds, especially Carl Zeiss Jena designs, and I've listed some of the best-known lenses here. One particularly interesting case to me is the Mir 1, allegedly a copy of the Carl Zeiss Flektogen 35 f2.8. I own a Mir 1 and I've reviewed the Flektogen, and quite frankly, I don't see many worthwhile similarities in performance if you're thinking of buying a Mir 1 instead of the classic Flektogen. One of the great advantages of the old Flektogen is its close focus capabilities. Some copies have an MFD of 0.18 meters. My Mir 1's MFD is as far out as 0.7 meters, a big difference. Away from the USSR, there are numerous examples of manufacturers copying successful optical designs in the past and producing less expensive lenses, including double Gauss designs, triplets, planar, Sonner and Tessa designs. There are far too many variations to cover in this video, but if you'd like to see the proliferation of just one, albeit very successful and important lens design, it's worth taking a look at Wikipedia's page on double Gauss designs and see all the lenses from different manufacturers using this design. Away from the more common optical designs, there's a less well-known Prince and Pauper involving the classic old Meyer Optik Görlitz Primo plan 58 f1.9. The Primo plan is based on a quite rare optical design, the Erno star. The Erno star was invented by Ludwig Bertoli, who was born in Germany in 1900. He also invented the Sonne design. These designs can produce gorgeous wide-open results, often smoother and more attractive than, say, Tessa designs. And that's probably one of the main reasons why the Primo plan's performance is so highly regarded. Now take a look at this Pentagon Praktica 50 f2.4, a lens made for B-series PB mount cameras. It's one of the cheapest old-faster 50s you can find for sale online. You may wonder what on earth this cheapo pancake-style lens has in common with the princely Primo plan. It's 50mm, not 58, and it's f2.4, not 1.9. Well, the Praktica lens is also based on the rare Erno star design, and owners have told me it's a top-performing lens for its almost giveaway price. According to Peter Snow, who kindly sent me some information on the history of the lens and is a big fan of it, the Praktica was actually designed by Meyer Optik as a lower-cost alternative to Tessas and Oristons. Peter points out that to keep the costs down, the lens was manufactured in Romania by a company noted for its high-quality military-grade optics, and the lens uses very high refractive glass. Since I own neither lens, I can't give you a demonstration of their comparative performance, but the Praktica, especially the metal version, a second version had more plastic, may well be worth a look at some point in the future. The third category of princes and paupers are the modern interpretations of classic lenses, and there are a variety of lenses that fit into this category. First of all, there are the lenses reissued under the brand names of the original classics. For instance, you can buy new Primo plans, Trio plans, Biotars, and Lidis, made under the Meyer Optik Görlitz brand name. In Russia, the classic Helios 40 was resurrected by Zenit, and there are still brand new versions available online. Pentax, to take one more example, have reissued a few of their classic lenses with improved coatings. However, I'm not going to talk any more about these lenses because, given the pricing, they don't fit into the princes and paupers story. Much more obvious princes and paupers are where manufacturers are currently making lenses that are clearly interpretations of classic lenses at a much lower price than the originals. In particular, over the past few years, various Chinese firms have been very active in selling re-engineered versions of classic, desirable, and expensive vintage lenses. I've reviewed 3 such lenses from TT Artisan, and I'm about to review a lens from Thypok. Each lens is a well-made and impressive performer. Take TT Artisan's new 75 f1.5 for instance. It's clearly an updated copy of the Carl Zeiss Jena Biotar, a famous old lens that is well out of reach financially to many people. Other notable lenses that get good reviews are the Chinese Leica M-mount copies, including, for example, TT Artisan's copy of the Sumeron 28 f5.6, costing a fraction of the Leica lens, and Light Lens Lab's copy of the 1966 Leica 50 f1.2, again for a fraction of the price of the original. The fourth category of princes and paupers are lenses made by the same manufacturer, where you get similar results from a cheaper version, or at least similar in certain ways. Perhaps the most unique example of this is the Helios Cyclop, designed for night vision equipment. It's essentially a Helios 40 without aperture blades. So if you're into Helios swirly style images wide open, you don't necessarily need to buy a Helios 40. I should add that some time ago these lenses were much cheaper than the Helios 40, but they're rarer to find today. Another lens in this category is the Takuma 55 f2. Pentax wanted to sell a cheaper version of their classic standard 55 f1.8 lens. Instead of designing a new, cheaper standard lens, they simply inserted a small round disc inside the f1.8 lens, thereby reducing the aperture size and slowing the lens to f2. Other than this insert, it's exactly the same lens. Then there's the lens I promised to let you know about at the end of my YouTube review of the Carl Zeiss Ultron 50f2. The Ultron is understandably an expensive old lens. It's seen as one of the classic, iconic film-era fast 50s. I mentioned in my review that if you're interested in the classic Carl Zeiss Ultron style rendering, rather than buying the lens itself, there's a much cheaper option on the market worth considering. And no, it's not the similarly named Color Ultron, produced under the Voigtlander brand for Rolex QBM mount cameras, although it could have been that lens. No, it's a lens that is generally even less costly than the Color Ultron, and it's the Rolex HFT planar 50 f1.8. Aficionados out there will know the strong connection between the Carl Zeiss Ultron, the Voigtlander Color Ultron, and the Rolex planar. The Carl Zeiss Ultron was actually made under Voigtlander, so it really could have been called the Voigtlander Ultron. And then the QBM mount Voigtlander Color Ultron and the planar version apparently have the same design, they just have different names, and as I said, the planar versions are generally cheaper to buy. From what I've read, the Color Ultron and the planar were essentially designed to produce a similar performance to the Carl Zeiss Ultron, but at a much lower cost, i.e. without the expensive body, the high-quality glass elements, and the iconic concave front element. And look at that HFT name. HFT stands for High Fidelity Transfer, a multi-layer anti-reflection coating system co-developed by Zeiss and Rolex. It's seen as a reasonable approximation to Zeiss's very highly regarded T-star coatings. Here are some side-by-side wide-open test shots with the Carl Zeiss Ultron and the planar taken wide open. It's quite hard to tell the difference, but my own view is that the expensive Ultron produces ever so slightly richer colours, but those can be adjusted in post-processing. I'm a proud and happy owner of a Carl Zeiss Ultron, not least because of its sexy-looking body and concave front element, but really, as a casual user, I'd be more than happy with the Ultron-like rendering of the Rolex planar at a fraction of the cost. The fifth and final category of princes and paupers are cheaper lenses that can give you a very similar rendering or style of image as much more expensive lenses, even if they don't copy the optical designs. It's a kind of lens where owners say it renders just like a Leica Summicron, or it swirls just like a Biotar, even if it doesn't have a Summicron or Biotar design. There are quite a lot of claims like this from owners online, far too many to cover in this video, so I'll focus on just a few of the more interesting examples. Starting with the Leica Summicron, a design that appeared in various versions over the years. The old Summicrons, the 50f2 lenses, are very highly rated on photographic forums. Finding budget lenses that perform like the Summicron is a bit of a holy grail pursuit online. And some people think they've found the answer. It's the XR Raikkonen 50f2, a lens that's been described as the poor man's Summicron on the basis of its performance. This has a Pentax K-mount, and the version of the lens that seems to be the one with the magic touch is the one with no letters after the XR Raikkonen name. I have to say, when I look at wide-open images from the Raikkonen and compare them to the photos I took for my review of the Summicron R, the results do look familiar and similar. According to some people, the lens was made by Tomioka. I really have no idea whether this is true, but I do know some lenses that were definitely made by Tomioka that fit into the princes and paupers category. Tomioka has a rather cult status as a manufacturer these days. You can spend a lot of money on Tomioka-made 55 f1.2 and f1.4 lenses. They were often sold under different brand names, and it's not always easy to spot a Tomioka-made lens, but the real deals are becoming more expensive. Tomioka lenses are highly praised for their rendering, especially their dreamy bokeh. They tend to produce lovely results wide open, not necessarily the sharpest wide open, but their images can be very beautiful, and they do sharpen up nicely stopped down a little. Plus, if you're interested in extravagant flares when a lens is pointed straight into a bright light, then you should enjoy Tomioka-made lenses. I'm regularly encouraged by owners to review one of the Tomioka-made 55 f1.4 lenses, the M42 mount Sears, or Otto Räikkönen for instance, and maybe I will one day. However, there are slower Tomioka-made lenses that are exceptional value for money in my opinion, and they don't sell for the typical Tomioka cult status premium. One such lens is the Otto Chinon 55 f1.7 in M42 mount. I bought it for £25 this year online, and there are other copies for sale at around this price in the UK, although to be fair it can cost more in other countries. The lens came in different versions and was produced in large numbers. My copy is one of the early versions. Why do I think this version was made by Tomioka? It's because of the focus ring's design and covering material. Here's exactly the same design on a 55 f1.2 Auto Revuenon. How do I know this lens is a Tomioka? Well, that's easy, because Tomioka engraved its name on the front of the lens. My copy of the Otto Chinon f1.7 is a fine lens. It's good to use in action. The aperture and focus mechanism are smooth and well damped. While the lens is well built, one downside with the quality of that build is that the covering on the focus ring almost always separates at its ends, as you can see here, and sometimes it can fray. It's not very pretty. Performance-wise, the results are typical Tomioka. Beautiful dreamy rendering wide open, and sharp stop down with good colour contrasts. Many Tomioka lenses were made with radioactive glass, but my version of the Otto Chinon is not radioactive, a big advantage if you don't like using radioactive lenses. If you would like to try a good value lens with radioactive glass made by Tomioka, and manufacturers tended to reserve this kind of glass for their best lenses, then try the Mamiya Seiko 55 f1.8, in my opinion another exceptional value for money lens. With these much less expensive f1.7 and f1.8 lenses, you're not going to get the kind of excessively narrow depth of field as you do from the f1.2 or f1.4, but wide open, you're still going to see a lot of lovely out-of-focus blur, 90% of the performance for a fraction of the price. The final Prince and Pauper pair I'd like to talk about is a rather ironic one, involving a Helios 44-2 as the Prince. 10 or so years ago, I would never have described a Helios 44-2 as a Prince. It was more like a Pauper, a cheap, mass-produced lens. However, over the years, the Helios 44-2 has become more popular and more expensive, more princely. So in the world of swirly lenses, there's a new Pauper to consider, a Petri 50 f2. You can also buy a Cosino branded version. It's the same lens, and both are Pentax K-mounts. I'll stick to the Petri. The Petri is a very inexpensive lens. Right now in the UK, you can buy the Petri, as well as the attached camera, for less than a Helios 44-2. The lens is reasonably well made. It has metal parts in the right places, but it feels a little flimsy. It's certainly a Pauper compared to the heavy metal of the Helios. Performance-wise, it's not bad at all stop down. In fact, I'd say it outperforms the Helios in terms of rendering and colours. And the important thing about the Petri is that it swirls like a Helios wide open. If you like swirls, then this is a very good value option. Of course, you may need to buy a K-mount adapter for your camera if you don't have one, but on the positive side, and this is an LBA alert, you'll then be able to try some of the other excellent and good value K-mount lenses out there. So to sum up, we've seen a mix of low-cost, good value lenses and a few quite expensive lenses that still cost a lot less than the classic originals they're based on. I hope there's been something of interest to you, even if you already knew about many of the Princes and Paupers I've covered. In terms of modern copies of classic lenses, I'm personally rather excited that firms are taking the time and effort to recreate famous lenses I've always wanted to try, but couldn't justify buying at the price the originals sell for. Before I go, I'd like to quickly delve a little deeper into one assertion I made at the start of the video about lenses delivering 90% of the performance for 10% of the price, and discuss the 10% of performance that is missing, because it can be quite important. If you take the fast 50s, not only do some of the so-called Paupers perform in a similar way to much more expensive lenses, many slower lenses are top performers, and some f2 lenses in particular are said to be amongst the sharpest film-era lenses ever made. When you stop down to f5.6 or f8, it can sometimes be hard to distinguish between the rendering of different old lenses, expensive and fast, or cheaper and slower. Having said that, stop down, classic lenses can produce a certain look that their cheaper counterparts simply cannot produce, and this 10% extra is actually very important to the lens's appeal. To take just one example, the early classic lenses can produce a golden tint that can be very appealing in certain compositions when you're shooting in colour, and it can also be good for stronger contrasts when the image is black and white. This is not just because of radioactive glass. The old and aging coatings of non-radioactive lenses can also produce a warmer, vintage look compared to new lenses. Wide open, the difference between Princes and Paupers can be even more marked. The faster lenses will obviously produce a different depth of field look, and there can also be differences in how the out-of-focus highlights look. Take the images produced by the Rolei Planar and the Carl Zeiss Ultron. I said earlier that the lenses produce similar results, but if you want to be really picky, the Ultron's bubbles are slightly rounder and juicier. It's not immediately obvious, but once you see it, it's hard to forget. That extra 10% can make quite a difference to your view of how lenses perform, and as ever, the final decision on whether or not to buy a Prince or a Pauper comes down to personal taste, what and how you like to photograph, and the size of your wallet. Please don't hesitate to suggest other Princes and Paupers in the comments below, and apologies if I've missed any of your big favourites. Until the next time, all the best.